Hello and welcome to the review for our final exam. I hope most of you have had a good semester so far. For those of you who have and for those of you who haven't, I imagine you're very excited to be wrapping things up. What we're going to do today is I'm going to give a video discussion of what's coming up on the final exam, try to give you some hints into how you might be able to prepare for the final exam, and even some hints into some of the questions and how to break them down. I'm going to divide the discussion into a discussion first of the general rules for the exam, and then follow it up with a discussion of what kind of questions should be coming from each chapter. Obviously, if having watched this you have any questions at all for me, feel free to contact me. Um, it's been great, and I see that most of you are doing very well. So first of all, we should look at my philosophy for creating an exam in a course like this. I feel like a lot of the value of the course is the extra that you get from having your instructor tell you things that might not be in the book, or things that are presented in the book in a way that you might not have initially understood. And so I've designed the course to have a great deal of overlap between what I talk about and what the book talks about. And so if you just read the book and you don't do anything to prepare by listening to any of my materials, you should probably get an 80% if you know everything that's in the book. And if you've never looked at the book, if you don't own the book, if you don't pay any attention whatsoever to what's in the book, but you do pay attention to these slides and to the videos for the course and other materials, you should probably get about an 80% there as well. So a great deal of overlap, but there's some things that just reading the book won't be enough for, and there's some things that just listening in class won't be enough for. And I'll try to point out as we review for the final exam places where you should probably go to find information if you don't have it just yet. Now, you have one attempt at this. So if somehow you mess up and you close the exam or whatever, you don't get to take it again. Once an exam is opened and then closed, it can never open again. So be very careful as you go through and answer the questions that you don't accidentally log out or whatever. Make sure you have a reliable computer as you're taking the exam. Next step is I'm going to start talking about the chapters and what you can expect to find in each of the chapters and the types of questions that you will find in each of the chapters. Chapter 1, remember, was our introduction to political science and to rational choice theory, and also to concepts related to government. So things like, what is a republic? What is a monarchy? What is an autocracy? What is a tyranny? Things that they've introduced to you again and again through much of your student life, from past into the present, but also things that our textbook and our course have definitions that you should be familiar with. That one of the things that we've added that's different this semester, kind of kicking it up a notch because we're in college, right? We have talked about a theory that will help us understand political science, and that's called rational choice theory. And as such, we've touched on some things like the principal agent model, transaction costs and conformity costs. We've talked about several different, often called games or situations where there's two people, and how do they come to a conclusion that's either beneficial for the individual or mutually beneficial. There's the prisoner's dilemma, the chicken game, the coordination game, and the tragedy of the commons. And you should be familiar with all of these. You should be able to identify what a free rider is. Remember, a free rider is not just somebody who rides and doesn't pay, right? It's somebody who doesn't contribute to a collective action, doesn't contribute to the benefit of everyone, and yet gets to benefit individually. So you should pay some attention to what a free rider is. Now, if we were to look at an example, and in chapter 1, I'm going to have an example where you're going to want to puzzle through that example and determine what type of situation it is. Maybe it's a example where somebody's paying a transaction cost. Maybe it's an example of a principal agent model, or a tragedy of the commons, or a coordination game. So you should know these concepts well enough that if somebody gives you an example, you'll be able to discuss it and understand it. Chapter 2 talks about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. You'll have like ideas like the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan and the Connecticut Plan, each of which are different ideas that were designed to organize Congress. The Connecticut Plan, or sometimes called the Great Compromise, is central to the type of government that we have today. So you should understand it. But the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan were the two initial suggestions by those states, proposals by those states, from which the Connecticut Plan was developed. You should be familiar with the Three-Fifths Compromise, perhaps one of the more controversial concepts from the Constitutional Convention, but which was necessary to determine how enslaved people would be treated in terms of representation. Remembering, of course, that enslaved people were not going to be represented because they weren't going to be able to vote, but the southern states wanted to get credit for them as though they were citizens. We also should be familiar with the separation of powers, checks and balances, the necessary and proper clause, sometimes called the elastic clause, and you should know how to amend the Constitution. And remember, it's a two-step process. A constitutional amendment must first be proposed at the national level and then ratified at the state level. And so you should look back through the book or through the slides to see where you can find information about how the Constitution is amended. That is in Article 5 of the Constitution, but I'm sure you could find an easier way to understand it through charts and graphs and stuff. Chapter 3 is about federalism. One of the most important things that we should know about federalism is that the United States has become much more centralized over the years. One of the best ways to think about that is that in the 1780s, when people talked about the Federalists, they were the people who believed that the central government should be strong. The anti-Federalists were against a strong government. The Federalists were for it. Now, when you hear people in modern America talk about the Federalists, when I belong to the Federalist Society, somebody might say, who's been nominated for the Supreme Court. If those are the people who believe that the Constitution gives less power to the government, the national government, than the national government currently exercises. And most of this is because of the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is a portion of Article 1, Section 8, which says that Congress is in charge of interstate and international commerce. And, a lot more interstate and international commerce today than there was in the 1780s. You should look at concepts like externalities and public goods are also thrown in there. You should look at the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment's probably the one part of the entire U.S. Constitution which stands up for the Federalist system in the United States. You should look at dual versus cooperative federalism as well. And then finally, be familiar with the concept of grants and aid. These are funding from the national government down to the state level. And the two main types of grants in aid are block grants and categorical grants. And you should look those up. In chapter 4, we move on and we change gears, right? The first 3 chapters are about governmental structure. Chapter 4 is about civil rights. Chapter 5 is about civil liberties. And so you should know the definitions of civil rights and civil liberties as we gave them in the course. You should also be familiar with the many ways that especially southern states, but other states as well, tried to take away voting rights from African Americans in the aftermath of the 15th Amendment. Remember, the 15th Amendment was passed in it was 1870, I believe, and when that happened, it gave African Americans the right to vote under the Constitution. It said that race would not be a reason why you cannot vote. However, in practice, that's not what really happened. And how did southern states avoid this? Well, things like the literacy test, things like the white primary. And in Georgia, remember, we had property requirements. And in other states, in other states, they use different plans in addition to that, such as the poll tax. In a way, the property requirement is like a poll tax because if you own property, then you're forced to pay property taxes, and then the property taxes go to support the election. And if you don't pay your property taxes, they didn't let you vote. Next, we should look at types of segregation. You should be familiar with de jure segregation, which is segregation under the law, and de facto segregation, which is segregation in practice. We should be familiar with the concept from Plessy versus Ferguson of separate but equal. I'd like you to be familiar with the grandfather clause. The thing about the grandfather clause is that it never kept anybody from voting, right? Somebody will say, it never kept, you will hear people who disagree with this, but the grandfather clause was actually something that was developed in other states that was used by southern states in order essentially so that they could enforce the literacy test just against African Americans and not against white voters. But the grandfather clause, and they still have to this day, people who have benefits that are then taken away to new people. But once you have the benefit, it isn't taken away. That's called a grandfather clause. So if your grandfather had been allowed to vote and now you couldn't read or you didn't own property, you became a loser, then you were still allowed to vote. So the grandfather clause doesn't directly take away anybody's right to vote. It basically let white voters out of the rules that they were setting for African Americans. And then finally, we didn't just talk about African American voting rights. We also talked about women's voting rights in Chapter 4. And so you should be familiar with the struggle for women to receive the right to vote. One group that you should be familiar with is women's suffragists. I think some people confuse suffrage with suffering, and that's not the same word. But when we talk about African Americans getting the right to vote, we talk about the franchise. By the time women received the right to vote, they just had a different term. Don't confuse suffragists with feminists. The feminist movement is something that's sort of a little bit later in history. We're mostly just talking about the right of women to vote. Chapter 5 talks about the breadth of civil liberties under the U.S. Constitution. You should be familiar with the civil liberties that are in the First Amendment. They talk often about 5 freedoms. They've combined the 2 elements of religious freedom, the free exercise of religion, with the Establishment Clause, but you should be familiar with those. I might ask for examples. I might say, which of the following is not a civil liberty protected by the First Amendment? And so the wrong answer could either be something that isn't in the First Amendment or isn't even a liberty at all. You should be familiar with the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. You should be familiar with the Miranda rule. Remember, the Miranda rule does not actually give you the right to an attorney. It doesn't actually give you the right to remain silent. It just informs you of those two rights. And so, if I say, where does the right to be informed by a police officer when you're arrested, that you can remain silent and that you have the right to an attorney, that doesn't come from the Fifth and Sixth Amendment. That comes from the Miranda rule. And then finally, you should be familiar with the idea of incorporation, or applying the Bill of Rights to the states. This is something that didn't happen prior to the 14th Amendment, and it didn't happen after the 14th Amendment either. What actually happened is that in several court cases, starting in the late 19th century, but going all the way up through the present day, one by one, provisions of the Bill of Rights have been applied to the states. Usually when the Supreme Court has determined that someone has had their general concept of liberty stolen from them by state governments. Chapter 6 talks about Congress. So you should be familiar with the leaders of Congress. I gave you a list, but especially the President of the Senate, the Majority Leader, Minority Leader, what a whip is. In the U.S. House, we're talking about the Speaker, the Majority and Minority Leader, and who the whips for the Majority Party and the Minority Party are. You should know who they are. You should know what they do. You should know how they rank in terms of power, and you should know what the job entails. The President of the Senate is just the Vice President of the United States, so you should definitely know who she is. You should know about gerrymandering. Why is gerrymandering more important in the House than the Senate? Well, because they don't have districts in the Senate. You should know about the process for vetoes. You should know what the filibuster is and what cloture is. With Chapter 7, we start to talk about the presidency. One of the most important things to keep in mind with the chapter on the presidency is that this is a place where we diverged from the book. The slides talk about the 6 powers of the president rather than the president's powers as head of state versus his powers as head of government. And so when you're thinking about the 6 powers of the president, well, first and foremost, his political powers as leader of his party and as the political leader of the government. But also he has executive powers, he has legislative powers, which is to say his powers in conflict with Congress. His executive powers are his powers over the legislative branch, and his judicial powers are his powers in relation to the courts. He also has diplomatic power, his power in international relations, and he has power as the head of the military. So we say military power, diplomatic power, executive, legislative, judicial, and political power are the 6 powers of the president. In the slides, we talk about some of the aspects of each of these. You should know about executive agreements, executive orders, executive privilege. You should know about divided government. Right now we have divided government. That's when one or more branches of Congress, one or more chambers of Congress are led by a different party than the president's party. Know what a pocket veto is. You should know with the president that his powers come from Article 2. Later you should know that with the courts that their power comes from Article 3 of the Constitution. Chapter 8 talks about the other portion of the executive branch, which is the bureaucracy. So you should know about Weber's 6 characteristics of a bureaucracy. You should know, you should be able to identify whether a particular governmental organization is part of the bureaucracy. For instance, no part of the Georgia government is part of the U.S. bureaucracy. They're part of the Georgia bureaucracy, but not the U.S. government bureaucracy. Nobody in the legislative branch, members of Congress or their staff, they're not in the bureaucracy. The only people in the bureaucracy are members of the executive branch who are permanent employees, so not elected, not appointed. Permanent employees who are members of the executive branch of the U.S. government. You should know how the bureaucracy is controlled and structured. So you should know about the GAO. You should know about inspectors general. You should know about the Federal Register. Until something goes into the Federal Register, which is like a newspaper of the U.S. government, until a rule has been published in the Federal Register, it hasn't really taken effect. And you should also be familiar with the concept of red tape. Now, Chapter 9 changes pace a little bit and starts to talk about the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, should you know who all the justices are? Well, that would, in a perfect world, yes. If you're just trying to pass this test, you should definitely know who the Chief Justice is. You should know who the longest serving justice is and the newest justice. You should probably know who the justice is that's from Georgia. You should know how many members the court has. You should know the 3 writs or legal orders that are often most associated with the Supreme Court. The writs of certiorari, of mandamus, and of habeas corpus. They also order cases to be decided in light of their opinions, but we aren't going to focus on that here. You should know the difference between the Solicitor General and the Attorney General. You should know who nominates and then appoints members of the federal judiciary, and you should know who has to approve or confirm the nominations of members of the judiciary. You should know that they're permanent, that they have life terms, life tenure on the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts. You should also know that there's 3 levels, the top level being the U.S. Supreme Court, the next level the U.S. Court of Appeals, and the lowest level the U.S. District Courts, where trials are actually held. Kennesaw State's in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Here's our appeals. So now we make our turn for home. We have our last 3 chapters. Chapter 10, about scientific polling, about political behavior and public opinion. I think the chapter is actually called Public Opinion. How do you measure it? Well, you measure it often through polling. Scientific polling needs random samples. That's going to be a question on the test. Scientific polling needs random samples. You should know about partisanship, which is the most important determinant of how people are going to vote. Partisanship, ideology, values, sometimes called core values, and attitudes. The one-word definition of attitudes is opinions. You should know about ambivalence. That's not the same thing as not caring. It's when you care strongly about 2 things. So if you have 2 values in conflict with each other, maybe, for instance, the strong belief in civil rights for oppressed groups or for same-sex marriage, and at the same time you have a strong belief in freedom of speech. And so then an issue comes up where you have an ambivalence. You should be familiar with the concept of political socialization. That's not the tendency of the United States to become socialist. Political socialization is our learning where we exist within the political community, our sense of learning about politics and who we are in the political world. Chapter 11 talks about campaigns and elections. So you should be familiar with mobilization or getting out the vote. You should be familiar with campaigning. One of the only place that I'm aware of in the entire book where I ask you to where the only place you can get the answer is by reading the chapter. There's a long and very quality discussion of negative campaigning. And so I'd like for you to be familiar with the reasons why negative campaigning exists, not the least of which is because it works. You should know about focus groups, what midterm versus presidential elections are, performance voting, issue voting, partisan voting, the importance of money. And then finally in chapter 12, we're going to be talking about the political parties. Political parties are very important in the U.S. political system. Ever since the first mass political party in the world was founded in the United States, that's the Democratic Party, and they had the first national convention. They nominated Andrew Jackson, way back, 1832. The three-tier structure, the party in government, the party organization, and the party in the electorate. I have that slide that says pig, po, pie. You can think of it that way. You could talk about, you should know about presidential primaries. Pick the delegates who are now committed to candidates. This is an innovation of the 1970s. So between the 1830s and the 1970s, people would become delegates to the conventions and be able to vote however they felt they should. Now the rule is that on the first ballot, you're supposed to vote for the person who you've committed to vote for. We should learn that the secret ballot comes from Australia. It's sometimes called the Australian ballot. And then we had a really good section I really like, talking about the various party systems in American political history. If there's one you should know by name, it's the New Deal Coalition. But you should also be generally familiar with which parties dominated politics at different times. Wow, that was a lot. I talked for 30 minutes and I kind of hurried by Carl standards. And so there's a lot of material to cover, and I strongly encourage you. So often, one of two things happens. A student studies way more than they need to. They get a good grade, and they say, well, what else might I have done with that 2 hours that I spent studying? We don't feel too bad for them. Maybe they learned something. Maybe they lost a little bit of good time. But the other person's the one who we feel horrible for, the person who didn't study enough, the person who says, if only I had another bit more time. Maybe I'll send a message to Carl and Carl will let me take the test again or do extra credit, to which they'll find that they can't. Because this is your opportunity. This is opportunity to learn, to show what you've learned this semester. And if you haven't learned it yet, you can still pull things out by doing the studying now. But it's very important. 60 points is a very consequential part of your final grade, and students tend to do a little bit worse on the final just because all the other midterms they only needed to learn a little bit of material. Here we're bringing it all together. So anyway, I wish you all well. If there's any way I can help you, please feel free to contact me. I look forward to getting your grades in as quickly as I can. I wish you all luck, and I hope that you're able to enjoy the next few weeks after the class is over.